It was a winter unlike any I had known before, bitter, sharp, and endless. The kind of cold that seeped into your skin, coiling around your bones and whispering reminders of your fragility. Witherley Moor, an expanse of barren fields flanked by skeletal trees, stood at the edge of our village like a forgotten sentinel. Nobody dared venture there, not since the stories of frostbitten travelers and unexplained disappearances had taken root in our collective memory. Yet, on Christmas Eve, under a sky hung with a quilt of stars, I found myself trudging through its snow-draped desolation. It wasn't entirely my idea, of course. Claire, my younger sister, was the instigator, dragging me into one of her whims. Her laughter had rung out like bells, unbroken by the warnings of elders or the weight of local legend. "Just a little fun," she had said, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of the cold and her youthful exuberance. "We'll build the grandest snowman anyone has ever seen." And so we had. By the time we finished, the snowman stood tall and solemn, its oddly graceful form illuminated by the moonlight. Its face, hastily crafted with lumps of coal and a crooked stick for a smile, bore an almost knowing expression, as if it had witnessed far too much for something born of mere snow. Claire had found the hat buried in the snow nearby, an old, black, wide-brimmed thing, with a dusting of frost and an air of forgotten grandeur. Without a second thought, she perched it atop the snowman's head. That was when something shifted. The silence of Witherley Moor, usually dense and complete, grew taut, as though the landscape were holding its breath. I felt it before I saw it, an unease prickling at the edges of my awareness, tugging insistently. The snow seemed brighter, reflecting an eerie, almost unnatural glow, while the air seemed to hum faintly, a vibration I could feel in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of overactive nerves and a night that had stretched too long. But when Claire turned to leave, her laughter trailing behind her like the tail of a comet, I hesitated. Something about the snowman, something in the snowman, kept me rooted. Its shadow stretched far too long for the moon's position. I told myself not to look back as we made our way home. Yet, before the moor disappeared from view, I couldn't help myself. And there it was, our snowman, standing exactly as we'd left it. But in that moment, it no longer felt like something we had made. I could not sleep that night. The house, usually alive with the warmth of crackling fires and the scent of cinnamon and cloves, seemed colder than it should have been. The wind held outside, rattling the shutters like an unwelcome guest demanding entry. I lay in my bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old beams, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than the restless nature of the season. Claire, as usual, had fallen asleep easily, her laughter from earlier still echoing in my ears. How could she be so untroubled? The image of the snowman, its shadow impossibly long and angular, replayed in my mind. I tried to think of anything else, the songs from the church choir, the gifts wrapped neatly beneath the tree, but the unease gnawed at me, persistent and unrelenting. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A faint sound, muffled by the layers of snow outside, yet distinct in its rhythm. Crunch. 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 Footsteps. I sat upright, my heart pounding. It wasn't uncommon for the occasional animal to wander close to the house, but this was too deliberate, too human. The sound drew closer, each step slow and measured, as though the walker was in no hurry to reach their destination. Sliding out of bed, I tiptoed to the window, careful not to wake Claire. Peeling back the curtain, I peered out into the moonlit landscape. At first, I saw nothing but the garden, its hedges cloaked in frost and snow sparkling under the moonlight. Then my eyes adjusted. The snowman was there. Not on Witherley Moor where we had left it, but standing just beyond the garden gate, its coal eyes glinting darkly. It wasn't possible. We had left it miles away. My breath fogged the glass as I stared, frozen, unable to look away. The snowman's form was unchanged, its crooked smile, its gangly stick arms, but something about its stance was different. It seemed purposeful. The hat, perched atop its head, appeared untouched by the wind or the frost that had collected everywhere else. The way it stood, just beyond the gate, was as if it were waiting. A sudden thud broke the stillness. I jumped, spinning toward the source. It came from the roof, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the house. Then another, closer this time, followed by a faint dragging noise. I scrambled to Claire's bed and shook her awake. "Get up," I hissed. "Now." She groaned, still half asleep, but I didn't wait for her to argue. Pulling her by the arm, I dragged her to the door and down the narrow staircase. "What's going on?" she mumbled, her voice thick with confusion. "I don't know," I whispered, glancing toward the frosted window by the front door. The snowman was gone. Before I could process what that meant, there was a scraping sound at the back of the house. Claire stiffened beside me, her hand clutching mine. "Is someone out there?" she whispered, her voice trembling now. I didn't answer. How could I explain what I had seen? How could I admit that I wasn't sure we were dealing with someone at all? A shadow slid across the kitchen window. It moved slowly, stretching unnaturally tall as it passed, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't cast by anything human. "Stay here," I said, my voice barely audible even to myself. "No." Claire grabbed my arm, her grip fierce. "Don't leave me." The shadow reappeared, this time at the front window. Whatever it was circling the house, its movements deliberate, almost taunting. I pulled Claire with me toward the pantry, shutting the door behind us and extinguishing the small lantern. We huddled together in the dark, the silence around us amplifying every creak and groan of the house. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Outside, the crunching of footsteps began again, moving closer to the front door. And then it stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, before it was broken by 3 sharp knocks on the door. The sound of the knocks reverberated through the house, a crisp and calculated rhythm that seemed to echo longer than it should have. 3 deliberate raps against the wood, followed by silence that pressed against my chest like an iron weight. Claire's hand gripped mine tighter, her small fingers trembling. I could feel her pulse hammering through her skin, and I knew mine was no steadier. We sat frozen in the pantry's suffocating darkness, the faint scent of dried herbs hanging in the air, listening for the next sound. But none came. Minutes passed, 5, maybe 10, though they felt like hours. Just as I began to wonder if whatever had knocked had left, the sound came again. This time, it was not a knock. The faint, deliberate scratching at the front door made my skin crawl. It was too slow, too calculated, as though the thing on the other side was savoring each movement. I could picture it clearly in my mind, a branch-like hand scraping across the wood, leaving icy trails in its wake. "I don't like this," Claire whispered, her voice so faint it barely registered. "Shoo," I managed, though my throat was dry and my voice cracked. I didn't like it either. The scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, I dared to hope it was over. Then came the sound of footsteps again, circling the house. They crunched through the snow with eerie precision, pausing every so often near a window or door. Each time, I imagined coal black eyes peering through the frost-covered glass, searching for a way in. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. We waited, breathless, straining to hear anything beyond the thudding of our own hearts. The silence stretched out, so absolute that it seemed unnatural. Slowly, I shifted my weight, preparing to move, when the floorboards above us groaned. Something was in the house. Claire gasped, her nails digging into my arm. I pulled her closer, both of us staring upward as the sound of deliberate, measured steps crept across the ceiling. They weren't heavy, but the sound carried with a strange resonance, like the weight of each step was amplified by the stillness around us. "What do we do?" Claire whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't answer. My mind raced, but I couldn't piece together anything that made sense. It wasn't just the presence of whatever was upstairs, it was the impossibility of it. The doors had been locked, the windows latched. Nothing should have been able to get in. The footsteps stopped directly above us. Claire whimpered, and I clamped my hand over her mouth, my own panic threatening to spill over. The floorboards creaked again, this time louder, as though whatever was up there was leaning its full weight down. I could hear the faint sound of something dragging across the wood, a rasping noise that made my stomach twist. The pantry door rattled. It wasn't a knock, not like before. It was a slow, deliberate movement, as though fingers, or something pretending to be fingers, were testing the edge of the door. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen, but my body refused to obey. The rattling stopped. And then, almost imperceptibly, the handle began to turn. The pantry door creaked as the handle turned, slow and deliberate, the sound piercing through the tense silence. I clutched Claire tightly, my breath held as though releasing it would draw whatever was on the other side closer. The dim light filtering through the slatted wood of the door revealed nothing, only darkness shifting beyond the threshold. Suddenly, the movement stopped. The handle snapped back into place with a sharp metallic click, leaving the room silent once more. The absence of sound was almost worse than the noise. The not knowing where it had gone filled the air with a choking tension. I dared a glance at Claire. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. I mouthed, "Stay here." She shook her head vehemently, her fingers gripping my sleeve as if letting go of me would be her undoing. But I couldn't leave us both cowering, waiting for the inevitable. Carefully, I pried her fingers loose and gestured for her to stay quiet. With every muscle in my body screaming against it, I crept toward the pantry door. My hand hovered over the latch, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might give me away. I counted silently in my head. 1, 2, 3. And then, with a burst of resolve, I pulled the door open. The kitchen was empty. It was colder than it had been before, the kind of cold that didn't just nip at your skin, but sank deep into your bones. The frost clinging to the window panes had thickened, spreading intricate webs of ice across the glass. The faint scent of pine mixed with something sharp and metallic lingered in the air. I stepped out, my breath clouding in front of me. The floor beneath my feet was damp, patches of melting frost marking a trail from the door to the staircase. Claire's small gasp from behind reminded me she was still watching, and I motioned for her to stay put. The stairs loomed ahead, the faint sound of something shifting upstairs sending a fresh wave of dread through me. I gripped the banister, my fingers numbed by the cold radiating from it, and began to climb. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. At the top, the hallway stretched before me, shrouded in shadows. A faint trail of frost glimmered on the wooden floorboards, leading to a doorway at the far end. My parents' room. The door was ajar, swaying gently as though coaxed by an unseen breeze. I took a step forward, and the movement caught something's attention. The creak of the floorboard beneath me was answered by a low, guttural sound, like the groaning of ice under immense pressure. My breath caught in my throat as the shadows within the room seemed to shift. And then I saw it. Perched in the doorway, its misshapen body partially obscured by the darkness, was the snowman. The figure was grotesque, its features contorted as though the snow had melted and were frozen in unnatural shapes. Its eyes, coal-black pits, glinted in the faint light, and its crooked grin seemed carved into its icy face. The antique hat atop its head was tilted slightly, as though mocking me. The frost spread as it moved, its heavy, deliberate steps cracking the ice that formed beneath its feet. It reached out one twig-like arm, the jagged branches coated in frost that gleamed menacingly. I froze, unable to look away. The snowman stopped mere feet from me, its head tilting as though studying me. Then it raised its arm, pointing toward the window. My eyes followed the direction, and I saw the field outside, bathed in the eerie glow of moonlight. The remains of our snowman still stood there, crumbled and shapeless, but something else had taken its place. A row of identical snowmen stood in the field, each one perfectly still, their heads turned toward the house. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The snowman in front of me let out another low groan, its jagged mouth twisting into an even wider grin. I turned and ran, barreling down the stairs with no regard for the noise I made. "Claire!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "We have to go." But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw her. She was standing by the window, her small frame silhouetted against the frost-covered glass. "Claire?" I called, my voice trembling. She turned slowly, and my heart sank. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her lips trembling as though forming words she couldn't say. Behind her, through the frosted window, I saw one of the snowmen standing directly outside, its grotesque face pressed against the glass. It raised a frosted hand and tapped 3 times. The tapping on the window was deliberate, each sound echoing through the room like a heartbeat. Claire stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the frost-rimed glass where the snowman's grotesque face loomed, its hollow eyes locked on hers. "Claire!" I shouted again, rushing toward her. My voice finally broke whatever spell had rooted her in place. She blinked, her body trembling as she took a shaky step back. The snowman outside tilted its head, the crooked top hat slipping slightly, as if mocking us. Then it raised its stick-like hand again and dragged a jagged line down the window. The sound was unbearable, a screech of ice against glass that sent shivers rippling down my spine. I grabbed Claire's arm and pulled her toward me, shielding her as best I could. "We need to leave," I whispered, though the words felt futile. Where could we go? Outside, the field was dotted with figures, motionless yet somehow alive with menace. The tapping stopped abruptly, and I turned back to the window. The snowman was gone. I didn't wait to see where it had gone or why. Dragging Claire behind me, I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks. My fingers were stiff from the cold, shaking as I turned the key. "Don't look outside," I said, though I knew it was useless. Claire was already staring through the narrow pane of glass beside the door. Her breath fogged the window as she spoke, her voice barely audible. "They're moving." I dared a glance. The snowmen in the field had shifted, their heads now turned toward the house, their twisted bodies leaning unnaturally as though they were being drawn forward by some unseen force. The door finally gave way, swinging open with a groan. A blast of icy air hit us, so sharp and bitter it felt like a wall. But we couldn't stay. Not with them closing in. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Claire with me into the snow-covered yard. The crunch of snow beneath our boots seemed deafening in the stillness. Every step felt like an eternity as we made our way toward the tree line, the dark expanse of the forest offering a sliver of hope. I glanced over my shoulder and froze. The snowmen were moving. Not like people, but with a strange, jerking rhythm. Their bodies seemed to disassemble and reassemble as they advanced, the snow swirling around them like a blizzard given form. The grotesque figures were closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on us, their twisted smiles seeming to stretch wider. I tightened my grip on Claire's hand and pushed forward. The edge of the forest was closer now, the towering pines swaying in the wind. But the cold was relentless, seeping into my chest, slowing my limbs. Claire stumbled, falling to her knees in the snow. "I can't," she sobbed, tears freezing on her cheeks. "It's too cold." "You can," I yelled, pulling her to her feet. "Just a little farther." But before we could move, a shadow loomed over us. I turned to see one of the snowmen standing only feet away, its jagged branches reaching out like claws. Its face, a grotesque mimicry of human features, seemed to twist in cruel amusement. I grabbed a fallen branch from the ground and swung it wildly, the wood splintering as it connected with the snowman's icy form. For a moment, it staggered back, the snow swirling around it in disarray. "Go!" I screamed, shoving Claire toward the trees. She ran, her small figure disappearing into the shadows of the forest. I followed, my lungs burning with each ragged breath. Behind us, the snowmen gave chase, their forms darting through the snow with unnatural speed. We reached the trees, the thick canopy above offering some protection from the biting wind. But the snowmen didn't stop. They moved through the forest as though the terrain meant nothing to them, their jagged limbs snapping branches, and frost spreading wherever they touched. Claire tripped again, this time over a root buried beneath the snow. I skidded to a halt, dropping to my knees beside her. "Get up," I begged, my voice hoarse. "I can't," she whispered, her face pale and eyes glassy. A shadow fell over us, and I turned just in time to see one of the snowmen reach for me. Its icy fingers grazed my shoulder, and a searing cold shot through my body. I screamed, swinging the broken branch at it again. This time, the snowman crumbled into a pile of snow and ice, but the victory was short-lived. More were closing in, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Then I saw it. In the distance, through the trees, a faint glow of light. A house. A cabin? I didn't know, and I didn't care. "Claire, look," I shouted, pointing toward the light. "We can make it." She nodded weakly, and together we stumbled toward the glow, the snowmen relentless in their pursuit. As we reached the clearing, I saw it, a small, old-fashioned cabin, its windows glowing with the warm, golden light of a fire inside. It looked almost unreal, like something out of a painting. "Help!" I shouted, banging on the door as we reached it. "Please, let us in." The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman wrapped in a thick shawl. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and grave. "They've claimed this place." The old woman pulled us inside, bolting the heavy wooden door behind her. The warm glow of the fire enveloped us, but it did little to banish the bone-deep chill that clung to my skin. Claire collapsed onto a worn armchair, trembling, her face as pale as the frost outside. The woman stared at us with an expression that was neither pity nor warmth, only resignation. She was quiet for a moment, then turned to me. "You shouldn't have come here," she repeated, her voice heavy with regret. "We didn't know," I said, struggling to catch my breath. "We didn't know it was cursed. We didn't know about them." She shook her head slowly, her gnarled hands clutching a cup of tea she hadn't offered us. "The field was cursed long before I was born. No one remembers the full tale anymore, only fragments, enough to warn us to stay away." Claire lifted her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "The snowman, it came alive." The old woman's lips thinned into a grim line. "It wasn't the snowman. Not really. That hat you placed on it, it belonged to someone long gone. Or so they say." I froze, the memory of the hat flashing vividly in my mind, old, threadbare, but oddly compelling, as though it had called to me. "Whose was it?" "A man who lived here decades ago," she said, her voice almost reverent. "He was cast out by the villagers, accused of unholy practices. On the coldest winter night, he swore vengeance against them. They found his body the next morning, frozen in the field where he'd cursed the land. She paused, her eyes narrowing. It's said that whoever disturbs his rest will awaken him. And his vengeance is unending. The fire crackled, and the shadows it cast seemed to twist unnaturally, as if echoing her words. But it's just a story, I insisted, though my voice wavered. It can't. A sudden, deafening knock on the door silenced me. The woman's face blanched. She turned toward the door, but didn't move to open it. It's too late now, she whispered. He's found you. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. The walls of the cabin seemed to groan under its force. Frost began to creep along the windows, the intricate patterns of ice spreading faster than they should, as though the cold itself were alive. Can't we stop it? Claire pleaded, clutching the armrests of her chair. There's no stopping him, the woman said, her voice hollow. Once he's marked you, the only escape is to give him what he wants. And what does he want? I demanded, my heart pounding. Her gaze locked onto mine, unblinking. To finish what he started. The door splintered with a thunderous crack, and the room filled with an unnatural chill. The snowman stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes glowing faintly, its twisted smile stretched wide. The crooked hat sat atop its head like a crown, and the icy wind that accompanied it extinguished the fire in an instant. The old woman muttered something under her breath, words I couldn't understand, but they sounded ancient, almost melodic. The snowman hesitated, as if the words reached something deep within it. Taking advantage of its pause, she turned to us. There's no time. You must go. Run to the church on the hill. It's the only place he cannot follow. Claire and I exchanged a glance, then bolted for the back door. The snowman let out a sound, low, guttural, and filled with rage. The temperature plummeted, and frost raced along the floor, nipping at our heels as we fled into the snow-covered forest. The church loomed ahead, its bell tower silhouetted against the night sky. The faint glow of stained glass windows promised safety, but the snowman was close behind. I could feel its presence, an icy dread that clawed at my spine. We stumbled into the church, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind us. Inside, the air was still, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the stone walls. Claire collapsed onto the cold floor, sobbing with relief. I turned to face the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But the snowman did not follow. He can't enter, a voice said behind us. I spun around to see a priest standing near the altar, his face weary but kind. This place is consecrated. He has no power here. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, slowly, the frost on the door began to recede. We stayed in the church until dawn, the priest keeping vigil with us. When the first light of morning broke through the stained glass, Claire and I ventured outside. The snowman was gone, but in the field, its twisted form lay crumbled, the hat sitting atop the pile of snow. I reached for it instinctively, but the priest's hand shot out, gripping my wrist. Leave it, he said firmly. Bury it deep. And never return. We did as he said, burying the cursed hat far from the field. As the snow melted in the weeks that followed, the field returned to its serene, unassuming state. But Claire and I knew better. To anyone else, it was just a patch of land, innocent and quiet. But to us, it was a warning, a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. And every winter, as the first snow fell, I couldn't help but glance toward that field, half expecting to see a crooked hat resting on a pile of snow, waiting for someone foolish enough to awaken the frost's revenge once more.